we lose. Like, I'm not joking. If we don't get the dub in the flip, we're losing this round.
Yeah.
I wish I was joking. They're gonna pick half.
You made this speech doc. You know what? We can doc bot. I don't even care. For this round, I am perfectly fine with you doc botting.
You know doc... Okay, actually, yeah, let's do it.
Like, I don't give a shit, bro.
Dude, I haven't doc botted in so long, though. Here, let me do it. Do you want to turn on camera? I'm afraid. I am very afraid. Judge is here? Aww. Brian, you asked for it, so I'm gonna do it. I think times like these.
Flips?
I can't hear you. Oh my god. I'm not paid for.
We're ready for flips whenever you guys are.
Awesome. We're ready too.
I think there may be an issue with my webcam. Let me just see if I can get that fixed real quick. Both my partner and I are in the same room.
Okay, got it. I have a coin, so whoever wants to call it.
We'll call tails if that's fine with Oak.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. It is heads.
Let me consult with my partner. Okay, we'll take the con side.
And I'm assuming the other team will speak second.
We'll consult with. Let me consult with my partner first.
Okay.
We'll go second. If you're fine with giving us a moment, I need probably like a few minutes to pre-flow, and I also need to reboot my computer just because my webcam, whenever it's been broken before at tournaments, so like whenever it doesn't work, I just need to relaunch the browser. So I'll be right back.
Yeah, no worries. For team 262, who's the first speaker?
Unmute.
I am, David.
Okay, great. Thank you.
And I'm Brian, second speaker.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm good on my side. So whenever you guys are ready, just go for it.
I think we're good when everyone else is. I can read case if the other team is ready. If not, just let me know when.
Oh, we'll be good to go in around a minute or two. All right, we're ready to go whenever. Okay, we're ready to go whenever.
Okay, great. So just a reminder, I am Kara, the first speaker on the con. I will be reading constructive. If everyone's ready, my time will start now. My partner and I negate resolve. The benefits of the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF, outweigh the harms. Our sole contention is destructive policies. When countries face economic struggles, politicians often feel pressure to accept short-term relief from the IMF. However, the IMF prioritizes short-term debt reductions over long-term health, as Larry Lee of the Journal of Policy Modeling in 2015 explains that they coerce countries to undergo massive adjustments with no regard for the country's unique economic and political conditions. There are two specific policies that the IMF has continually prescribed that, while reducing debt in the short term, create long-term destruction. The first is water privatization. Philip Aston of the United Nations explains in 2018 that to reduce government debt, the IMF forces states to sell ownership of their water to private companies as part of the requirements for receiving help. Sarah Grusky of Developmental Economics found in 2012 that these programs are widespread, with countries like Angola, Nicaragua, and Panama being forced to sell their water access to corporations. Unfortunately, these policies are aggressive and unchecked, allowing monopolies to form and raise prices above what the poor can pay. The impact of this is disastrous, as when the poor can't afford water, millions die from disease and thirst. Matt Colbert of the Water Research Institute finds that in 1994, the South Africa government rapidly sold access to water to private companies, resulting in the monopolization of the water supply that led to a 600% increase in water prices. Journalist Jacques Pa in 2014 writes that South Africa's privatization of water led to millions of civilians losing access to safe water, resulting in the worst cholera outbreak the country had ever seen. Overall, the IMF's promotion of aggressive water ownership has led to a profound suffering among the globe, as Rajesh Sajir of the University of Indonesia finds that currently 1.1 billion people lack access to safe drinking water. Second is social service cuts. To reduce short-term debt, the IMF forces countries seeking help to make drastic cuts to their social spending. Oxfam 20 finds that 84% of the International Monetary Fund's COVID loans encourage and in some cases require poor countries hard hit by economic fallout from the pandemic to adopt more tough austerity measures in the aftermath of the health crisis, cutting access to essential social services. This is important, as without the IMF, countries would be able to gradually stabilize their economy on their own terms, as Adam Taylor of the Washington Post in 2021 finds that countries that did not receive IMF help, like Japan, Lithuania, and Slovenia, were able to pass generous economic recovery plans. However, countries that feel pressure to accept IMF help fare much worse off, as an upshot of the global issue from 2018 finds that because the IMF prioritizes short-term debt reductions over long-term physical health, it forces countries to cut spending on healthcare, education, pensions, workers' wages, and more. This deepens the economic slowdown, as Hessler 18 of DW quantifies. In Indonesia, poverty rates rose from an official 11% to 60%, and GDP declined by 15% in 1 year. Compared to Malaysia, which also suffered in the crisis but refused IMF funds and instead imposed capital controls, allowing it to recover quicker. The IMF is not improving either. As Corkery of The Guardian in 2020 explains, in Ecuador, the effects of recent IMF social service cuts have been particularly disastrous, wreaking havoc on the country's economy as well as its healthcare system, exacerbating the country's vulnerability to the COVID-19 pandemic. These austerity measures will also hurt the people who need the social services the most during the pandemic, and the ECLAC estimates that Ecuador will be one of the countries with the highest increase in extreme poverty and inequality in the region as a result of COVID-19. The impact is long-term poverty. As Matt O'Brien of the Washington Post explains, that these destructive policies forced by the IMF create long-term economic depressions, thrusting millions into poverty and ruin. As Brunswick 18 of the Eurodebt adds, the loans don't solve the root cause of the debt and only serve to allow countries to procrastinate on their crisis, while the austerity conditionality pushes countries further into recession, reducing their capacity to carry debt burdens even further. Cabero of Oxford in 2013 continues. Then Europe austerity measures put in place after the 2008 recession caused an increase in debt instead of a decrease and pushed 120 million into poverty initially, with 25 million more as a result of continued austerity measures. Thus, we are proud to negate.
Can I call a few cards?
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah.
Can I first call this Aston 15 card?
Yep.
And then
That's the UN one.
And then the Monopoly card.
Let me cut it.
Actually, while you're cutting those, I'll also write down the other cards I need. All right, those should be the cards.
You tell me to send case. That's like 20 cards. Or
Those are 7 cards, but I'm fine with you just sending case.
okay. I guess. Send those. Kira, do you want to get the ones at the bottom? Besides watching the post, I got that.
Yeah, I got the ones at the bottom.
Oh, what's Malcobera 94? I
It
think you
should-
heard
it
it
should
wrong.
be-
What does it say?
It should be your South Africa in.
Oh, yeah.
It should be your
yeah,
South
got
African
it.
Keurig.
The 600% increase in prices or worst cholera outbreak? Or both.
I mean, I'm fine with both.
Cool.
Although I only need 600%.
Okay, about to cut the last water one. The Washington Post, it's a graph. Is that acceptable? I'll tell you what to control F to see the graph.
Yeah, just give me the control F and that's perfectly
Yeah,
fine.
yeah, awesome.
Sorry to interrupt. I don't know how far along you guys are with the cards, but would you mind giving like a pro speech? Like, do you
Yeah,
the card
my
right?
partner can just start the pro speech.
Sorry, I'm cutting it. I need to like flow. Is it okay?
I mean, I'm
Okay,
fine.
okay.
I think there's one left. Yeah.
I'm fine
Okay,
without the
okay.
cards being cut. That's perfectly on.
Yeah.
To be
I think
perfectly
the amount that you
honest.
send is fine.
Okay, I think this is it. Everything. Let us know if there's something missing.
If you guys can't understand me, I'll send a speech doc.
Oh wait, I was mute just then. You need to say that again.
Oh, I was just saying, like, I might go a little bit fast, but I'll send a speech doc over if it's, like, really that bad, and, yeah, I'll be as clear as possible. Alright?
Okay.
My partner and I affirm contention 1 is COVID recovery. Subpoint A is on credit worthiness. COVID-19 shutdowns have collapsed tax revenue, causing Phillips 20 of New York Times to find that governments are on the hook for billions in interest and principal repayments. This shock is much larger than 2008. Unless their interest rates fall or are given loan extensions, both of which require good credit, dozens of countries will default. Fortunately, Brumo 8 of the NPE writes that less developed countries draw on the credibility of the IMF for demanding macroeconomic restraint as a way to signal to international audiences that they are a safe investment destination because they have chosen to tie their hands. Thus, Tronke 20 of SSRN finds controlling for selection bias, there's a positive signal conveyed by the IMF's presence, and it serves as a cushion against falling credit worthiness. Improving credit worthiness is critical, as Cooper 18 of the balance writes, better solving loans can reduce inflation and make it cheaper to borrow money. Avoiding higher premiums and interest rates on debt is critical, as Yasin 20 of the JLE finds that a 1% increase in debt servicing will push down development spending by 4%. That's devastating, as an inability to afford or finance recovery would lead to dozens of defaults and make COVID recovery impossible for years. Subpoint B is on SDRs. The IMF repays its own currency known as SDRs in order to distribute them to member nations during a global economic crisis. The BWP 09 explains that SDR allocations do not involve IMF staff negotiating, meaning that there's no conditionality involved and no required policy changes. On top of being unconditional, SDR allocations are massive and free. Specifically for COVID, Reuters 21 writes G20 major economies have agreed to a new allocation of IMF SDRs totaling $500 billion. Every member of the IMF will receive its own share, immediately contributing to reserves. These instruments of SDRs are a way to provide liquidity to poor countries hit hard by COVID without increasing their debt levels. The effects are dramatic. Hard 20 of Yale University writes that SDR allocations increase reserves by 19% for low-income countries. This massive increase in reserves allows nations to avoid cutting social spending and to revitalize their economies by investment. Hard concludes that the 2009 allocation helped restore market confidence and supported global recovery. Today, the 2020 allocation is twice as large as 09, leading Sonnet 20 of SBD to find that SDRs are the most useful instrument to help contain the pandemic and keep the global economy from further collapsing. Recovery here is essential. Williams 20 writes that the pandemic could have risked 30 years of progress made by fighting global poverty, and 90 million people could be plunged into poverty this year alone. Contention 2 is on China. China has been increasingly lending to poor countries, as Gerstel 18 of CSIS writes recipient countries face rising debt to GDP ratios with at least 40% of debt owed to China. These countries will need support to service BRI loans. Fortunately, Abbas 19 of Georgetown writes when recipient states are overburdened with debt from China, they turn to the IMF for help. Nations like Pakistan and Ecuador are already negotiating bailouts. These bailouts are key as they pay off debts due in weeks, giving countries years to get their finances in order to avoid a default. Even if default still occurs, defaulting to the IMF is far better than to China. This forces both organizations to have better and more transparent practices in order to mint partnerships and influences. There are two impacts in this round, and the first is on bipolarity. Abbas continues, China took control of a strategic port in Sri Lanka once the government struggled to pay back Chinese financiers. Expansion through economic pressure has proven effective for Chinese ambitions, who continue to expand in the South China Sea and establish footholds in Asia and Africa. Chinese control over entire regions through debt allows them to compete with the US, leading to bipolarity. That's horrifying, as Isley 11 of Strategic Studies Quarterly explains that a bipolar world increases the incidence of proxy conflict, as proxies provide superpowers a mean to achieve geostrategic goals without the risk of nuclear war, as proven in Yemen, Syria, and Vietnam. Just one proxy war can kill millions. The second impact is on trade. Albert 19 finds that China has been expanding their maritime control over African and Asian ports, using it to house both military ships and trade ships. That's key, as the UN in 2017 finds that 80% of all global trade is conducted through ports, with China power finding 60% of world trade travels through the South China Sea. One nation controlling trade is devastating, as the ability to cut off all trade would give China massive leverage over other countries, forcing other countries to give in to China at risk of economic collapse. For these reasons, I urge a strong AF ballot.
Can I see some evidence, please?
Yep.
Can I see that they're expanding now? China. Sorry, it's gonna go bottom. The things I last heard. China like expanding now, like taking over ports and stuff.
Are you calling the Abbas evidence or?
Right after on your second like argument about trade, when you say China's doing all this bad stuff, like they're taking over.
Our second impact about trade. That card.
The link. You cite evidence saying China's expanding now.
Okay.
Can I have the impact evidence to SDRs and to your first two links?
Impact evidence to SD. Can you write this down while I pull the first few cards?
Do you want me to put in the chat?
Yeah, just put it like at the top of the live doc, just like.
Okay.
here or
Awesome.
something.
Hey, are we missing anybody? Who are we missing?
Oh, we aren't missing anyone. Two of the people in one team are in one room together, so.
Awesome. Thank you.
Hey guys, how are y'all?
Oh, we're doing okay.
Are you missing a judge?
No, I'm the judge.
Oh, I'm sorry. Are you missing a competitor?
No, one team is in one room together, so.
I apologize. I'm sorry.
It's okay.
Guys, carry on.
I think our cards should be in there. Let us know if you need.
Can I have like the SDR impact, like how many people SDRs pull out of poverty, and how many people like your first subpoint pulls, like the impact of that.
Sure. For SDRs, I don't think we have a specific number. We can send you this card.
That's fine.
Yeah, we don't really have specific numbers for either, I believe. But we do have like these cards.
That's fine.
Cards, which hopefully you can use. useful. David, are you ready for cross?
Yeah. I'm ready for cross.
Okay, cool. Let me just get the timer out. Is it okay if I ask the first question?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Okay, cool. So time will start now. So on your second contention about this China argument about proxy wars, how likely is it that there's going to be a proxy war? Because you say that like some countries are already taking loans from China. Like, what is the likelihood of this impact of materializing?
Okay, so while I would say like this is in like the long term, I would argue that like proxy wars like in general like they have a decent chance of happening, but I don't have an exact probability for you, but I would say that once China like reaches like the status of the US, then the likelihood of a proxy war is going to go up since like the China and the US have opposing views. Now onto your first like reason on water privatization, why is this necessarily bad if you expand the access to water in these developing countries?
So the idea behind water privatization is they're trying to help, and that's why they're doing it, but it's actually harming these countries because the IMF is forcing them to do it very quickly and very aggressively, causing monopolization. That's why the Grassley 12 card looks at Angola, Nicaragua, Panama, and other countries and sees that this causes them to see those monopolies that raises prices unaffordable for the poor. That's the South Africa example that you called, with a 600% increase in those prices, which means people can't afford the water. That leads to our impact of billions losing access and a worse cholera outbreak. It's all empirically proven. So back onto your case, on your first contention about COVID, and you talk about SDRs, special drawing rights, and you say like the reserves have increased. Like how has that translated to actual like people taking out the money? Like
Okay,
is
so
the reserve all the money that they have, or all the money that they're giving out?
I'm pretty sure I understand your question. You're asking like I guess you'd say like why do these reserves matter? First you could say our 20 evidence first says that like 19% of like low income countries, that increases the reserves for these countries so they have more time to like spend money on things that matter like healthcare. And we also read in case that this allows them to avoid cutting social spending and to revitalize their economies by investment, since these SDRs are free and each developing country gets a share. Now onto your water thing, you continue to say this like 600% water increase. You only cite like this one study from 1984. Why does this still matter now, where it's like literally 36 years old? Why does this example matter?
Yeah, I can explain that. So when we talk about this resolution, right, it's looking at the harms and the benefits of the IMF. We're taking an overall approach. If you're only looking at the IMF, right now, it's like you're not looking at the full scope of the harms. If they did harms in the past, those are still harms that they've done. Additionally, we have other examples from more recent times. We give you the Ecuador example. In Ghana, there was a recent problem with water privatization. Like we give you older evidence and we give you recent evidence, which shows that this has continued, and we give you the Colbert, the Washington Post evidence that shows that they're not changing their ways. But then I answered your question, so I'd like to ask a question onto your case. So you talk about how like China is allowing the IMF to compete with them and to become more transparent. So is that actually happening? And like, can you point to specific examples the way the IMF is better?
Yeah, I'll just quickly finish this. Cross is over, but I'd say like in general, right? Like that's how competition works. We'd say like the IMF is like one competitor and China's the other competitor. In your world where like the IMF isn't there, China's the only one there. They can put any conditions on their loans, which makes it worse for any country that has to go to China since the IMF is no longer there. I believe that's correct.
Okay.
Okay. I'm gonna run a bit of prep.
Okay.
Or start it once the call goes through my partner. Time. Well, it'll say on the call how much time. Okay, that was 30 seconds used. It'll just be straight down. Is everybody is my partner ready? My opponents and the judge? Time begins now. On their first contention about COVID, all of their evidence is specific to one crisis. You're going to prefer all of our evidence and all of our case goods looking at the IMF's continual practices over time outweighing on time frame. But let's get into the nitty gritty. They first talk about this interest and this loans idea, but there's a lot of problems here. The first comes from Larry Lee of ARC, the Journal of Policy Modeling, who finds, well, the IMF means well, that overlooks countries' unique political and economic conditions in making loans, opting for a one-size-fits-all approach. For example, they don't give you any examples of the loans helping these countries in the COVID crisis. But Mark Wiesbrough of the Center for Economic and Policy Research finds that the Ecuador COVID loans have vastly overestimated its economic growth forecast, leading it to do massive spending cuts that push millions into poverty. This turns your argument about debt, because when there's more people in poverty, that's less tax revenue the government gets over time, leading to them to have more debt in the future. But even at best, Alan Reynolds of the National Review explains in 1998 that the IMF offers short-term loans to help politicians gain favor with citizens. In the long term, these are destructive policies that undermine growth in the long term, outweighing the argument about in the long term, in the time frame, because they have to default more. Specifically, Seltzer-Brookings finds that these short-term loans create a moral hazard where countries are where politicians are able to do riskier policies, which he finds has led to 100 economic crises, outweighing their argument on scope. But in addition, what Bauer of Cambridge finds is that these IMF policies also undermine the legitimacy of governments and weaken the rule of the state, which is why he finds it creates a precondition for domestic conflict, increasing the chance of a civil war. This outweighs on one magnitude because civil conflicts directly kill civilians who are caught in the collateral, and more importantly, it outweighs because the government has to do more debt spending because to fight off insurgent groups, meaning in the long term there's more debt. In addition, so this is really important because when you look to the long-term, the holistic evidence, what Marcus Jordan of the Journal of Banking and Finance finds in 2018, that the IMF's encouragement of reckless policies increases the chance of a debt crisis down the road by a significant percentage of 2 points. And Robert Baer of Harvard University finds that every standard deviation increase in IMF loans lowers the rate of economic growth for the next 4 years by 0.5%. This is holistic evidence outlining on time from and specificity. They have zero evidence saying how many people they lifted out of poverty or how many people the percentage of growth IMF loans bring. They have no impact evidence. Then on SDR specifically, what the Economic Advisory Board finds is that they've only been used 4 times ever because the IMF runs out of cash if they do too much, so it literally ceases to exist, which means we outweigh on scope, only 4 times used, not a big voter. Secondly, they themselves concede that SDRs go to people who put more money into the quota, so he finds that 75% go to nations who don't need it, like China. Okay, now let's talk about their China argument. This is silly. They say that they kind of talk about how they do this kumbaya, there's going to be this great world where there's competition and it's so great. They paint this utopia, but the real facts are around contradicted. What the African analyst finds is that countries are increasingly going to China for help, meaning the IMF is not promoting competition. They don't prove any evidence saying that the China or the IMF is reforming. Or Oxfam evidence from 2020 finds that 84% of IMF loans still do austerity. There's no competition. On their impacts, their link to bipolarity is that China and the US are competing. They are competing right now in the status quo with the IMF. There's no proxy wars that they can name because as Woback 18 finds that bipolarity is inevitable and non-violent because both sides have a mutually assured destruction. No evidence of this. Then their second argument is about expanding and China's going to control trade. Their evidence says that their evidence says that China is expanding now. That means all of their impacts are happening now. The IMF isn't doing anything to solve it. There's no reason to vote AF. They have zero offense, zero impacts, actual impacts of things happening now, any impacts. That's why you're going to prefer the con side.
Oh crap, I was muted. Can I call a few cards?
Mm-hmm.
Can I? I'm just going bottom up. Can I call this Africa card where countries are going increasingly to China?
Yeah.
And then the Econ Advisory Board card.
Can you put them in the chat actually?
Yeah, sure. I'll just put that at the top of Live Doc.
I'm gonna put that at the top of the doc.
Okay.
Yeah. Econ Ad Board. They go to Then I just need the IMF debt crisis 2% number.
Advisory board.
And
the China one's at the top.
All right, great. That should be all.
Let me get. Oh, you want Brookings too? Hello? You want
Yeah,
the 100
Brookings
crises
as well.
too?
Yeah, the 100
Cool,
crises.
cool. Also, does the judge want to be on the card sharing document? Might be useful later.
That's the doc in the chat, right?
Oh, you can see it. Sorry, I thought you couldn't see it.
Yeah, it's in the chat.
Okay.
The
But
link-
yeah,
link should-
I'll see it maybe like after if I really need to, but I won't really mess around with it during the round.
Sounds good. Okay, that's everything.
All right, great. I'll start with a minute of prep. I'll start my timer once I mute myself. All right, we'll run 20 more seconds once I mute. Okay. Is the judge fine with an off-time roadmap? All right, so off-time roadmap, it's going to be 2 overviews on the top of their case, then just going down their case. I'll spend the rest of my time on my case. If time permits, I'll give you a weighing overview at the bottom of my case. My time will start at my first word. 2 overviews at the top. They first claim that developed countries are forcing water privatization and austerity measures, but these countries have a vested interest in making sure developing countries do well since they're economically interdependent. That's why all their evidence about IMF programs having austerity and conditionality are terribly outdated. Since the start of the pandemic, Gallagher 20 post states and explains that the IMF is no longer doing austerity and is focusing on healthcare spending. Empirically, Simmons 06 explains that the IMF loans were associated with greater healthcare spending in dozens of countries. They give you one card. That card is their Oxfam card, which is 84%. Call the card, look at the evidence. It's really bad because this 84% number includes just general negotiations with the IMF and these countries for debt repayment. That's evidence is really bad. But then we tell you that defaults are much worse. Defaults are worse because the IMF is the lender of last resort, and countries go to the IMF when they are on the brink of a debt default. Absent the IMF, countries would default, which outweighs their link into economic harm on severity because they have to privatize all industries, including water, and increase the amount of resource extraction to stay afloat. These countries also lose all international lending credibility, locking them into decades of poverty, while IMF loans have empirically succeeded in improving and restricting economies, which is why the OSED concludes that in the long run, GDP has increased by 20% under IMF loans. That's why you're voting for us on time frame, because their time time frame for these spending cuts is only 4 or 5 years during the IMF loan. After that, in the long term, it's going to be better. The economy will improve. But then what's even more key is that when these nations go to a debt default, that's because their governments don't have money to do this spending on social spending in the first place. That's really clean, because that means that when they do all this water stuff, our bird card tells you that because governments don't have the cash to spend on this water, they have to cut on the water if they don't get these loans and privatize part of it anyways. That means that you're preferring us because we're telling you that without the IMF, they wouldn't be able to sustain this social spending anyways, and they go into a sovereign default, which is much, much worse because they'd have these terrible lasting impacts of poverty and this cyclical inability to escape this because their sovereign credit is defaulted. But then we tell you that privatization generally is better because privatization of water frees up this government spending for other programs, because Chase finds that privatizing water sector reduces burden on public budgets, allowing them to reallocate spending or avoiding debt crises. This is also really key because Chase 15 finds that water privatization only happens in circumstances when local governments fail to adequately distribute water to their citizens when they request private assistance. For these reasons, Salma 8 finds that global access to water increased by 58 to 84% due to privatization turned that evident. But then on their second contention, they basically tell you all of these evidence of social services being bad. First, cross-supplier overview, we're telling you that when they don't have IMF loans, these nations can't pay for these social services to begin with. So those social services are zilch, and they will cause the country to have a sovereign default. It's much better to cut social services temporarily or not, because the IMF is no longer doing that now. As we tell you, it's either much better to either cut them temporarily and have long-term gains, or these countries will face a brink of default. Let's go into our case. They tell you a few things. First, they first tell you that there's this overview on time frame. They give you this time frame weighing. We give you our counterexample for time frame weighing. You can prefer us on the time frame because IMF loans are temporary. In fact, our Ragov card says that IMF nations pay off debt, cross-apply this to their moral hazards, because IMF nations are paying off their debt. It's just a one-time thing. It's not a recursive loop, which means that once they're done with the debt, they can increase spending on social spending, which is really clean. Their impact is only for a few years. Our time frame is for the long term. It pulls their nation out of recession. It avoids a complete debt collapse and debt spiral. Onto our China evidence. They tell you a few things. First, they tell you that all these African nations are going to China. That's true. Ecuador and Pakistan went to China, and when they defaulted, who did they turn to? The IMF. Absent the IMF, nations like Ecuador and Pakistan would have just had a sovereign default, which is much worse because they'd be locked into decades of poverty. But thankfully, the IMF was there. The IMF bailed them out after they made a bad decision and turned to China. But then they tell you that there's competition right now and there's no proxy wars. That's only economic condition. That's not the same thing. Competition. For those reasons, we urge a strong affirming ballot.
Ready for cross?
Yep, you can have the first question. Let me just pull it.
Awesome. Time starts now. So you say that debt defaults cause privatization, but you also say that privatization is good. So if the IMF causes debt defaults, that causes privatization, but you tell me that privatization is good, doesn't that mean that the IMF is good?
Okay. Doesn't that mean... Hold on, can you explain your question?
So you read a turn saying that debt defaults cause privatization because they need cash to pay it off, right?
Yeah.
You also read evidence saying that privatization is a good thing because countries, there's like more competition. So given that you double turn yourself and you say that the IMF prevents debt defaults and that which makes privatization, and that privatization, is that not a reason to vote for?
Okay, what we're saying is when privatization happens to begin with, like when it happens, it's because these governments can't do it, which is why overall privatization is more beneficial, because when they're privatizing and offloading the costs of sustaining water while giving it to a company that can actually supply this water to the region, which they can no longer afford to do, it's overall better because A, they no longer have to pay this huge increase of costs, and B, that area gets coverage. So privatization on net is much better for the government. Now, let's go to your...
Okay, sure. But okay, you'd say that debt default is the link into that, right? Like that's the...
We're
saying
saying
that debt default causes more privatization,
okay,
right?
We're saying that a debt default would lead to them selling it off at ridiculous prices.
Okay, you're saying that it outweighs, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Let's go into your case. You've had 2 minutes. So you tell us all about like how you tell us all about how the GDP is doing worse. What would be the alternative to the IMF in this case?
They gradually enact economic reforms that allow them to pay off the debt. For example, can I finish? You drop our evidence from the Asian financial crisis, where Indonesia rejected IMF help, did their own gradual reforms such as capital controls, and recovered much better. Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Okay. So this 20%. So let's talk about the Gallagher evidence. What does it say? The paragraph after it says that that austerity might be going down.
You tell me. You're asking.
It says austerity is going to go up in the future. So is that a reliable source of what the long-term indication outlook is for IMF policies?
I mean, all we're arguing is that after the IMF loan is repaid, it doesn't matter what the conditions are, because then these conditions are no longer here because they're so the time frame is still small. Okay, so you tell us how Malaysia was able to gradually reform. How do countries who don't have the money to pay off their next how do countries who don't have the money to pay off their next loan do gradual reform?
They do stuff like taxes, like they did gradual tax hikes on capital gains, capital controls. But that's time.
Okay, that's time.
I think we're gonna need to run a bit of prep. Are you ready, Kara?
Yes.
Okay. It'll start once the call goes through.
All right. It'll start on the top of our case and then to their case. Okay. If everyone's ready, time will start now. The most important thing you need to know in this round is whoever wins the link into debt defaults wins the whole round because debt default is the link into water privatization and into their arguments about China and credit. They read this overview that says developing countries have a vested interest in this helping these other countries with these loans because austerity and things like that. But remember, the reason they're taking these loans is because politicians want short-term debt reduction, but they're causing long-term harms, and so we're still seeing major harms. Secondly, they cite this OECD card about GDP increasing 20%. This only looks at 7 countries, whereas our evidence looks at over 40 countries and is more holistic, and you should prefer that because we're looking at the greater trend. First, then onto their case. This is really important because this is the place you're voting. On the Brookings evidence, we tell you that there's a moral hazard because of these IMF loans. They've caused 100 economic crises. This outweighs on scope because this is more than they've listed. They say that they can't pay out a debt, but they provide no evidence, whereas we give you clear analysis that these 100 economic crises empirically happened because of the IMF. Then on the Cambridge evidence, where we tell you because of these IMF loans, they weaken state sovereignty and cause domestic conflict. This outweighs for 2 reasons. First, magnitude, it impacts more citizens who are caught in the crossfires, and secondly, because there becomes more debt, which is worse. And this is a precondition for civil war, which goes unresponded to. Then on the Marcus Jor card, which explains that empirically, that those who take IMF loans see a 2 percentage point statistical increase of likelihood of having a debt crisis. This is the most important evidence in the round. This outweighs everything because and any terms on our case because they say themselves that defaults are the worst possible outcomes, insofar that taking IMF loans cause these defaults to happen are more likely to cause these defaults to happen, proves that you're always voting con because the IMF is making the very thing that they're saying happen more likely. Additionally, the civil war outweighs because their China evidence is happening right now. Jones tells you in rebuttal that their evidence is talking about how their impacts on materials because China is expanding, but because they're expanding right now and they cannot prove that there's actually any materialization of their impacts. You're looking at the civil wars first because we give you the warrants as to why and the analysis as to how. Lastly, on to our case, any offense there is outweighed by the Marcus turn about debt crisis increase, and that's why when they say defaults are the worst thing that happens, you're always looking towards voting to the con because the con tells you empirically with evidence, like how they cannot, that debt crises are more likely with IMF loans.
Run me a minute.
We'll start with running a minute. We'll probably run more after. Time will start once I mute.
Wait, what?
Wait, hold on. Pause prep. Did you need something?
Sorry, no, I was just calling my partner and I forgot I was unmuted.
I'll just resume prep in a moment. We'll run another. How much prep did I use for my first rebuttal?
15 seconds. We still have time. 15 seconds.
We'll just run like 15 seconds to begin with. Okay, that was around 25 seconds.
All right. I'll just basically quickly go over overviews, and then I'll be frontlining my case, and then Actually, I'll be going over overviews. I'll go to their case and then I'll go to my case. All right. Then my time starts at my first word. Once again on the austerity overview, you will always buy our Gallagher 20 card because it postdates and shows that the IMF is no longer doing austerity. They say that right after the card that austerity is going to come back, but our card literally says that austerity will go down, and it says that we increase focus on healthcare spending, and you always extend Simmons 06, which isn't even answered, that associated with greater healthcare spending to the IMF. Now let's quickly go down to their case. This is a link weighing round. They first read this like Brookings 100. They read this Brookings 100 banking crises card. It doesn't matter if you don't buy this, but if you actually look at the evidence, it shows that it was only one guy who thought that this was related to the IMF, but every other person in that study said that it was probably because of domestic issues, so you can never buy that. And now they continue to read like the Civil War's impact, and they read this card that says that it leads to a 2% increase in like debt crisis. But you know this is based on moral hazard, and on the moral hazard argument, why would a country just screw over their own people for no good reason? It says like the IMF will always bail them out, but on that point, they say this whole round that the IMF is so bad. If the IMF is always so bad, why don't these countries just leave? There's still 190 members in the IMF. There's no reason why these countries wouldn't have just vanished and gone to China, which shows that the IMF is the best in this round. It is the best. It is the best on the comparative. And also, if you don't buy that, Rogoff explains that nations pay off debt. They don't buy when they tell you that they're long-term evidence, because there is no debt repayment in the long term. These countries will solve the issues. And now, finally, they read this one last response. It says like these countries will recover on their own. Literally the definition of the IMF is the lender of last resort. It's where you go when you have no other options. They read this one example on Indonesia. How can you buy that? There's been so many examples. You buy those over just one like cherry-picked example of Indonesia. And now, quickly on the Civil War impact, they continue to read this. It doesn't matter. They don't give us a probability on the Civil War, and we would argue that the probability there is just a wash. Now it's going to our case. They continue to outweigh this round, and like their only response is just like these countries will just go to China no matter what. That doesn't make any sense. We've already showed that in our world, if China abuses these countries will go back to the IMF. That just makes sense. But in their world, the IMF is no longer there. China can abuse these countries no matter however they want, and also remember that taxes don't work in developing nations. And now let's go into weighing. They continue to weigh this link on the default, but you know that we win this link into default. With the IMF, they're the lender of the last resort. If you don't have the IMF, the only place to default is to go to China. And even if you don't buy that, China is the most likely area. So ours isn't really necessarily linked into default. So we tell you when the IMF is gone, these countries will go to China no matter what, and China will give them loans, which is why you always outweigh us on probability and magnitude. Their sole impact is on Civil War. They don't never give you a probability of that. There's a much better probability on how China has already taken ports in the past when these countries don't repay it back. So on the weighing, you weigh us on magnitude. China controlling the South China Sea affects millions of people, while their impact on Civil War literally one, don't give a quantification, and two, we always win on probability. And also on scope, we affect more countries with China, and now they're only linked into this Civil War card is this like increase in debt crisis, but remember that's never going to happen because the Lincoln is on moral hazards, which is really shady. You can never buy it. You will always vote F in this round.
Ready for cross?
Yep, we're ready for cross.
Okay. Can we get the first question?
Yep, you can have the first question.
Okay. Kara, can you ask it?
Yeah, sorry. Okay, so you're saying you outweigh on probability, and on this South China Sea argument, are you extending both the bipolarity and the trade impacts?
We're mainly extending trade.
Okay, so can you tell me the probability of China controlling the South China Sea?
Actually,
And
we're
doing
mainly
the
going for
impacts they're talking about?
Can you just repeat your question?
Yeah, so you're telling us like our Civil War impact doesn't matter because we can't tell you the probability of a Civil War, but then your impact about the South China Sea cutting off all trade, like how probable is that?
How probable is that? I mean, China can do it whenever they want. It's really happening right now. If like China, like for example, right? If you can.
So it's happening right now while the IMF is existing.
Can I explain?
Cool. So if it's happening right now. So you can explain. Okay.
Okay. So first, we're mainly just saying that, like, for example, if you control like 1/3 of global trade, right? That's a very big impact compared to an impact of yours. Like Civil War, one, you don't give like the amount of lives, and two, the link into that is like an increase in debt crisis, which you guys never really explain. I don't.
Okay. Some clarification. Our argument is that we're going for the Civil War term that links into debt default, because the argument is conceded that Civil Wars cause more government spending, which is why our 2% debt default argument is conceded.
Why did these Civil Wars happen in the first place?
Because the IMF programs undermine the legitimacy of the state and governmental control. Programs such as cutting social spending in the
Okay,
short
so
term
on the
cause more
social spending,
government.
right? Like,
Look, look.
Okay.
This was just conceded. Your only response is there's no probability. Can I finish, please? So
Yeah.
we're saying the reason this outweighs is because your own argument in second rebuttal is that debt defaults cause millions of spending, millions of people to fall under spending cuts, and millions of people to fall under privatization.
Can I have a question? You guys have had.
Yeah.
Question. All right. So once again, like, if the IMF is so bad, why are there still like 190 like countries in the IMF?
The argument is that politicians use it to gain short-term
No, you don't answer my
these
question.
cuts cause
No, I'm saying
long-term.
Okay, let me just quickly reiterate. I'm saying if the IMF is so bad, why are these countries still with the IMF? Why don't they just, as you do what you say, recover on their own? Why are there still 190 countries in the IMF if the IMF is so bad?
Politicians would rather say, when politicians are faced with a crisis, they'd rather say, hey, look, citizens, I'm going to save it, here's some debt relief. Not, hey, look, citizens, I'm going to impose a bunch of taxes on you that's going to really cost you a paycheck in the long run.
On taxes, who are they going to tax in Africa?
Everyone? Why can't
Okay,
you
so
ask
how are you
them
going to
that?
tax citizens in poverty? How are you going to get enough money to keep social spending going while also repaying your debts?
People in poverty get taxed.
Yes, but how
That's
much
a
are you
thing
going to
that
make
happens.
from them? How much are you going to make from them?
Okay, I think
The taxation is minimal.
I think we're getting lost in the weeds. Our argument is that politicians stay in the IMF because it's an easier option than the alternative.
Because it's a quick benefit they can get from just reducing the debt and showing, look,
In
I've
the
done
long
everything.
term,
They're
the
not
cuts
responsible.
cause a civil war, causing a debt default
Okay.
to millions.
The end of this.
Okay. I don't think we have any prep time left. Is that what you have, Judge?
Yeah.
Okay. Partner ready? Opponents ready? Judge ready? Time starts now. There's a lot of arguments in this round, but the ballot is very, very clear for the con. Our path to the ballot is our civil war turn. What Cambridge finds is that since IMF programs undermine the legitimacy of the government and cause civil unrest and citizens becoming mad at the government in the medium term, they revolt, cause domestic conflicts. This warrant goes conceded. They just say there's no probability. This Cambridge evidence is a statistical analysis of IMF programs. I urge you to call it if you doubt its credibility. This is important because Kara says that this creates military spending by the government that creates debt defaults in the long term. My opponents never respond to our evidence from Marcus Storer that Kara extends that says the IMF increases debt defaults in the long term by a statistically significant percentage of 2 points. This is cold conceded. This civil war argument and this 2% empirical evidence is cold conceded. Easiest place to vote. And my opponents themselves and we both agree that debt defaults cause huge drops in spending, pushing millions into poverty. That's the argument they make. That's the argument we make. That's one thing we agree on. Debt defaults causing millions to go into poverty. So here's why this outweighs my opponent's argument about China. One, it is conceded. This 2% argument about debt defaults is conceded. They never answer this empiric or really the civil war argument besides just saying there's no probability. Second is on urgency. Their whole argument is about China will take over trade, but they concede that China is doing that now. They agree that China is taking over the South China Sea, taking over Africa. That means all of their impacts are happening now under the IMF. You have no reason to vote for my opponents. Secondly, they don't extend any impact evidence as to how many people this will push into poverty, or they extend any warrants as to why this will push people into poverty. China controlling trade, they don't actually extend a reason why that links into poverty. Thus, our impact is the cleanest. You know that the IMF has increased debt defaults. Our evidence is conceded. They concede the one thing that China is controlling now. It's very clean for the con side.
I think I have like approximately 10 or 15 seconds, so I'm just gonna use that real quick. Okay, that's 10 seconds. Okay. My time will start at my first word. You're voting on defaults. On their ballot, he tells you it's really clean. He tells you this dropped 2% evidence and their dropped civil war turn is the reason why they're winning this round. And he tells you it's so clean, but we beg to differ. Two reasons why. First off, their 2% evidence solely relies on the moral hazards. Call the card, it explicitly says that in the study itself, in the conclusion of the study, this 2% increase in chance is because of moral hazards. We take this moral hazards down for two reasons. First, because their 100 crises card explicitly says this is because of domestic crises, not because of the IMF. It has no reason to an attribution to the IMF. But second, because Rangoff explains that all nations who have IMF loans pay off their debt. There is no moral hazard. There is no long term because in the short term, these nations pay off their debt, and once they do, they're done. They no longer need to implement these austerity measures. But then he tells you that this cause of civil war is social spending, and that's really clean because they concede that governments don't have the money to conduct social spending. We clearly explained, and this has been dropped, that when like these countries are on the brink of default, they don't have the money to pay for social spending. But when they get an IMF loan, it's really clean because the IMF A gives them money to continue a bit of social spending, but B allows them to continue operating their government as normal. If they were to continue social spending, they would default already. There is no that's why on time frame they're not winning on that because their civil war wouldn't have triggered because a default would have already triggered. That's why it's really clean on our side because in this round, if absent the IMF, nations turn to China where they instantly default. But the IMF has been successful. Each time the IMF has pulled these nations out of the brink of a debt collapse, which is really key because under China, they collapse. Their only response to China is that the IMF is on urgency. The IMF is bailing them. But we tell you that the IMF is bailing them out and is already solving in nations like Pakistan and Ecuador. They're already paying off these debts to China and solving China's seizing their infrastructure. For those reasons, we are just strong affirming ballot. Thank you.
Good round. Thank you for judging.
Good round.
Good round. Thank you for judging.
Yeah, no problem. Good round. Normally I would want to like give feedback, but we did kind of run over. So, oh wait, actually I did want to ask for cards. Hold on. I think everything is in the doc that I wanted to look at. Hold on. Okay, let me just make sure. Let me let you know what cards that I wanted to see. So the moral hazard card. And let's see. Oh, the 100 crises.
I can also show you, like, for the 100 crises where, like, I made my argument.
Does that include the 2% default? Because we were evidence.
Yeah, I think that, yeah, 2%.
I'll put this both at the top. Yeah, of the document, right?
I can also put like the part which I cited from their card if that helps.
Yeah, you can maybe like highlight it or something. Just like let me know.
Yeah.
And I think
For the 100 banking crises card, I just looked at the second paragraph.
Let me just
The
put
paragraph
it
right
up in the
after highlighted.
This is where I got this stuff. I'll just highlight it and I'll just.
Sorry, wait. I also want one more card. Can I also see the Rango card? Or I don't know.
Rangoff?
Yeah, I.
Okay.
The one about paying off debt. Yeah, I'm not sure if I got the name right.
Okay.
We also, do you know when the next round is? The notification hasn't went out.
Oh, the next one, I got a message saying that it was pushed to 8, something.
Okay.
Okay.
I'll pull the card for you.
Okay, Oakton has, the con team put their evidence, it's highlighted.
Okay. Oh, yep, I see it. Okay.
All right, I just pulled the card. It should be pasted in a moment. Wait, hold on. I'm just pulling the control app since. It seems like the entire PDF is just an image, so I'm just going to like copy and paste the part which I cite. I'll just continue to find that, but that's the explicit phrase that I cite.
Okay, I might not need the card. It's fine. I don't want to take up too much time. Yeah, I would give you a decision, but I need to honestly look over my ballot one more time. So I'll just let you guys go. So good round.
You need any more
judging.
cards, right?
No, I don't need any more cards. I'm good. Yeah, I think I'm fine.
Okay. Thank you for judging.
Thank you for judging.
for judging.
Good luck in your next round.
Good luck.
You guys too.
Thanks, you too.